Last time we spoke about the fall of Saipan. General Smith's coordinated attacks on June the 27th led to significant progress, with the 4th Marine Division notably advancing. As the 27th Division encountered resistance, the casualties rose. By early July, Americans gained ground, pushing towards Marpy Point. Japanese resistance remained fierce, but American forces steadily advanced, capturing strategic positions. The assault on Pedro Sakura was swiftly countered, but intense action unfolded in the Makunsha region. The 3rd Battalion 24th Marines faced a fierce enemy thrust with over 200 attackers killed. Facing defeat, General Saito ordered a suicidal assault, resulting in a chaotic and desperate charge. Despite heavy losses, American forces repelled the onslaught. The battle lasted until midday on July the 7th, with sporadic skirmishes continuing. Efforts to persuade cave occupants to surrender intensified, yet many civilians chose mass suicide. Saipan was declared secured after extensive casualties for both sides. This episode is the Battle of Noemfoor. Welcome back to the Pacific War Week by Week podcast. I'm your dutiful host, Craig Watson. But before we begin, I just want to remind you all that this podcast is only made possible through the efforts of Kings and Generals over at YouTube. Perhaps you want to learn a bit more about World War II? Kings and Generals has an assortment of episodes on World War II, and so much more, so go give them a look over at YouTube. So please subscribe to Kings and Generals over at YouTube and continue to help us produce this content by checking out www.patreon.com/kingsandgenerals. Hey, don't forget about our sister podcast over at The Age of Conquest, The Fall and Rise of China podcast, written and narrated by me. And if after all of that, if you're still hungry for some more Pacific War content, why don't you check out my personal channel, the Pacific War channel over at YouTube. Over there I'm releasing a series on the Japanese invasion of North China and Inner Mongolia. Also, please take a look at my Patreon account at www.patreon.com/thepacificwarchannel. For as little as $2 a month, you get access to the exclusive Patreon podcast, early access to all of my content, and voting rights for what I will tackle next. The latest exclusive podcast over there was on the Force Z disaster and the end of the battleship. Check it out. General MacArthur unleashed a new offensive, seeing General Patrick's troops successfully land on Noemfoor with little opposition, securing a beachhead. While the 3rd Battalion 503rd Parachute Regiment was being airdropped on July the 4th, Colonel Sandlin's 3rd Battalion continued eastward through scattered minefields towards Cornosoran Drome, meeting no resistance. Simultaneously, the 1st Battalion crossed the Kimiri River and occupied Kimiri Village without encountering any opposition. Moving out of Kimiri, the American forces followed a southeastern road to a sizable Japanese garden area where they faced resistance on Hill 201. The Japanese garden area was about 600 yards long east and west, and about 350 yards across north to south. The ground was devoid of large trees except for a few atop of Hill 201. But thick secondary jungle growth covered the eastern and southern slopes of the hill, while the rest of the garden area was overgrown with partially cultivated papaya, taro, cassava, all averaging about 8 feet in height. The trail from Kimiri Village passed over the southern slope of Hill 201, and 300 yards away near the eastern edge of the gardens joined the main road from Kimiri Drome to Namber Drome, located about 6 miles to the south. Another trail ran along the eastern side of the hill, branching to the north and northwest at the northeastern corner of a low-terrain feature. To counter this, a double envelopment tactic was initiated, with Company C seizing Hill 180 to the north while Company B pushed the Japanese southeast over Mission Hill, a lower terrain feature situated southeast of Hill 201. By 3:15, the battalion secured the ground on both flanks of Hill 201 and consolidated around the hilltop for the night, establishing a tight defensive perimeter. At 5:20 a.m. on July the 5th, the Japanese launched an attack along the southern and southeastern sides of the perimeter with motor support. The American forces responded with a deadly barrage of motor and artillery fire, driving the enemy back and neutralizing their machine gun positions. Some Japanese managed to get through the motor and artillery barrages, and they continued up the sides of the trail from the south, from which fire from Company D's machine guns hit them. The enemy found cover behind a low 150-yard-long log fence which led from the southeast towards the center of the 1st Battalion's defenses. While the fence afforded some protection, the attacking infantrymen were silhouetted as they tried to clamber over the top. The main body of the attacking force therefore kept down behind the fence, trying to crawl along it to the top of the hill. Advancing cautiously, the attackers encountered sustained machine gun and rifle fire from the defenders atop the hill, as the fence did not extend beyond the outer defenses of the 1st Battalion. The assault quickly deteriorated into a sequence of small suicidal charges carried out by a group of 3 to 6 Japanese soldiers. The 1st Battalion now sent patrols out over the battlefield. From prisoners, it was determined that the attacking force had consisted of about 350 to 400 men of the 10th and 12th Companies, 219th Infantry, reinforced by approximately 150 armed Formosan laborers. During the morning, over 200 dead Japanese were counted around the 1st Battalion's perimeter, and the number of the enemy dead found or enemy wounded captured on subsequent days along the trails leading south from the hill indicated that virtually the entire original attacking force had been annihilated. By 6:30, the skirmish had concluded with over 200 Japanese casualties tallied. Following this engagement, operations on Noemfoor transitioned into a series of patrol activities as Allied forces extended their dominance over the island and rapidly expanded the airfield facilities. On the morning of July the 6th, Sandlin's 2nd Battalion executed an amphibious landing on the deserted Namber following a brief naval bombardment. By July the 10th, intensive patrolling had only encountered small Japanese groups, leading Patrick to conclude that no significant organized enemy presence remained on Noemfoor. To eradicate the remaining opposition, the 503rd Parachute Regiment was dispatched to the island's southern sector while the 158th addressed the northern half. By the end of August, Sandlin's efforts had resulted in the death of 611 Japanese soldiers, the capture of 179, and the loss of 6 American lives with 41 wounded, and the liberation of 209 slave laborers. The Japanese had never brought the Melanesians of Noemfoor entirely under their control, for the natives had either offered a passive resistance or they faded into the interior to live off the land. A few were impressed into service by the Japanese, while others were captured but still refused to cooperate and they were executed. The natives greeted the Allied landings with great enthusiasm, and they came out of hideaways in the hills carrying Dutch flags which they had concealed from the Japanese. Under the direction of the Netherlands Indies Civil Administration, the natives were gradually resettled into their old villages. Late in July, the village chiefs gathered in formal council and officially declared war on the Japanese. Thereafter, native cooperation increased. Up to August the 31st, the natives had captured and brought to the Allied outposts more than 50 Japanese, and they had killed another 50. One tale of horror concerns the Javanese on Noemfoor. According to information gathered by the NICA detachment, over 3,000 Indonesians were shipped to Noemfoor in late 1943, mostly from Surabaya and other large cities on Java. The shipment included many women and children. The Japanese, without regard to age or sex, put the Javanese to work constructing roads and airfields almost entirely by hand. Little or no clothing, shoes, bedding, or shelter was provided. The Javanese had to supplement their very inadequate allowance of rations by shifting for themselves. Driven by hunger, many attempted to steal Japanese rations, but for their pains, they were beheaded or hung by their hands or feet until dead. Starvation and disease took a steadily increasing toll. The dead were periodically collected for mass burial, and survivors alleged that many of the sick were buried alive. It was considered probable that no more than 10 or 15 Javanese were killed accidentally by Allied forces. Yet only a 403rd of the 3,000 odd brought from Java were found alive on Noemfoor by August the 31st. Meanwhile, Colonel Jones pursued the remnants of Colonel Shimuzu's Noemfoor detachment to Hill 670 to the south. From July the 13th to the 16th, both sides engaged in fierce combat for control over the hill, while the Japanese ultimately managed to evade capture. Contact was re-established on July the 23rd near Inasi, but Shimuzu eluded capture once more. The primary Japanese force was finally located on August the 10th near Hill 380, prompting Jones' 1st and 3rd Battalions to converge in an attempt to trap the enemy. However, on the 15th, Shimuzu once again evaded capture, slipping away towards Pagriki. Although the Japanese forces were either captured or eliminated by August 17th, Shimuzu evaded capture or death and remained at large by the operation's conclusion. Jones's forces endured 57 fatalities and 302 injuries, but managed to neutralize over 1,100 Japanese soldiers, and they apprehended approximately 560 individuals, while liberating an additional 194 enslaved laborers. This brings the total casualties for the Battle of Noemfoor to about 1,730 Japanese, with 740 taken prisoner, and 63 American fatalities, 343 wounded, and 3 missing alongside the liberation of a total of 403 slave laborers. Now, moving over to the developments on the Aitepe front post-Operation Persecution, significant changes occurred under General Gill's command starting on May the 4th. The defensive setup of the Aitepe region was revamped, and Colonel Howie's 127th Regiment bolstered its eastern positions with the Nyaparake force, extending patrols to the Danmap River. However, General Nakai's advance forces arrived in early May, shortly after 2 a.m. on May the 14th. After a short preparation by grenades, light mortars, and light machine guns, 100 to 200 Japanese of the 78th Infantry, 20th Division, attacked from the east against the coastal sector of the perimeter. This assault was broken up by rifle and automatic weapons fire and by lobbing mortar shells to the rear of the advancing enemy group. The Japanese disappeared into the jungle south of the narrow beach. For the next hour, Captain Fulmer's mortars placed harassing fire into suspected enemy assembly points east of the small stream. Meanwhile, an 8-man outpost reported that many small parties of Japanese were moving up the beach within 300 yards of the main perimeter, and then slipping southward into the jungle. Such maneuvers seemed to presage another attack. The second assault came at about 3:30 a.m., this time against the eastern and southeastern third of the defenses. The Japanese were again beaten by small arms and motor fire, but at 5 a.m. they made a final effort which converged the entire eastern half of the perimeter. This last attack was quickly broken up and the Japanese quieted down. At about 7:30 a.m. on the 14th, elements of Company A, the 127th Infantry, began moving into the forward perimeter to reinforce Captain Fulmer's beleaguered units. The 1st Platoon of Company C and the 81mm Motor Section also moved forward in preparation for the coming advance. General Martin took charge of the east sector, and on the same day relocated all troops except the Nyaparake force to the western bank of the Drinamore River. The east sector forces were supplied by a variety of methods. Units along the coast were supported directly by small boats from Blue Beach or by native ration trains moving along the coastal track. Supplies to the Afua area went south from the coast along the Anamo-Afua Trail or later over the inland trail from the Taji Fields through the Chinapelli or Palaru. Wheeled transport was impracticable except for short stretches of the coastal track. In early June, when the Japanese ambushed many ration parties, which were attempting to reach Afua, experiments were made by air supply from the Taji strips. Breakage and loss were heavy at first, but air supply rapidly became more successful as pilots gained experience and ground troops located good drop grounds. A dropping ground cleared on the west bank of the Drinamore, about 2,200 yards north of the Afua, soon became the principal source of supply for troops of the Afua area. Communications during operations east of the Drinamore were carried out principally by radio, but between units along the river from the stream back to the higher headquarters, telephone became the principal means of communication. Keeping the telephone lines in service was a task to which much time and effort had to be devoted. The Japanese continually cut the lines, or American troops and heavy equipment accidentally broke the wires. The enemy often stationed riflemen to cover breaks in the line, thus making repair work dangerous. Usually it was found less time-consuming and less hazardous to string new wire than to attempt to find and repair breaks. As a result, miles of telephone wire soon lined the ground along the trails or was strung along the trees in the Drinamore River area and back to the Taji perimeter. Despite this adjustment, General Nakai escalated pressure, advancing beyond Yakamul by the month's end. In response, General Gill replaced the Nyaparake force with the 1st Battalion 126th Regiment, which swiftly recaptured Yakamul and Parakovio. Despite initial success, General Nakai's forces launched a heavy counterattack in early June, reclaiming Yakamul by June the 5th. In the meantime, additional Japanese units had been conducting exploratory missions inland against Afua since the beginning of the month. However, Howie's 1st Battalion ultimately succeeded in repelling them. This allowed Martin's forces to establish an outer defensive line along the Drinamore River. From there, they continued forward patrols towards the Japanese lines. While the 41st and 51st Divisions struggled to move personnel and supplies to the forward assembly area, Nakai efficiently organized a counter-reconnaissance screen along the Newman Creek to prevent East Sector troops from gathering intelligence about deployments farther east. On June the 20th, due to the increasingly dire situation in western New Guinea, the 18th Army was suddenly transferred from the 2nd Army control to the direct command of the Southern Army. Although General Tarachi's directive was to execute a delaying action at strategic positions, General Adachi opted to adhere to his original plans for a westward offensive. He was determined to maximize his effectiveness of his forces while they still possessed fighting capability, aiming to divert as much of the enemy's strength as possible away from western New Guinea battlefront. Sensing an immediate heavy enemy assault, Generals Kruger and MacArthur decided to reinforce Aitape with General Cunningham's 112th Cavalry Regiment, arriving on June the 21st, and Colonel Edward Ted Starr's 124th Regiment, expected to arrive in early July. They also expedited the shipment of the 43rd Division from its New Zealand staging area to Aitape, necessitating the establishment of Major General Charles Hall's 11th Corps. Upon assuming command of the task force on June the 29th, Hall reorganized his forces and implemented several troop redeployments in preparation for a looming enemy attack. On June the 30th, Adachi had completed concentrating his forces in the assembly area. Consequently, he initiated preparations for launching an attack against the Drunamore River line on July the 10th. His strategy involved Colonel Nada Masahiko's 237th Regiment crossing the river and launching an assault westwards towards Coronel Creek, and northwest to clear Animo and other Pop villages. Meanwhile, the 78th and 80th Regiments were tasked with clearing the Afua area and advancing along the way to Chinapelli. Success in this endeavor would pave the way for the Japanese units to advance towards the Itachi airstrips. Furthermore, a coastal attack force was designated to carry out a diversionary maneuver along the coast, aiming to engage the enemy and constrain them with artillery fire. In early July, as the Japanese finalized their preparations, Hall and Martin made the decision to dispatch robust patrols east of the Drunamore to the Harwich River. However, these patrols were only able to advance as far as Yakamul, where they encountered only the enemy's forward units. Consequently, on July the 10th, Hall and Martin ordered the 1st Battalion 128th Regiment and the 2nd Squadron 112th Cavalry to conduct a reconnaissance mission across the Drunamore. Subsequently, the infantry faced significant resistance as they pushed towards Yakamul, while the cavalry's progress was limited to about a mile due to the dense jungle terrain. Despite these efforts yielding disappointing results, a captured Japanese soldier disclosed that their attack was imminent that very night. However, this critical piece of information was mistakenly disregarded by the American command, leaving Adachi and Nakai posed to launch their counteroffensive. At around midnight, the assault commenced with the 1st Battalion, 78th Regiment charging across the Drunamore River, facing Company G of the 128th Regiment along a narrow front. The Japanese attacked in 2 or 3 screaming waves, broadening the front after the first assault by throwing the rest of the 70th Infantry and possibly elements of the 80th Infantry. Japanese reconnaissance had been good. The attackers knew the locations of company and battalion command posts along the American defenses, but not quite good enough. The enemy did not know that Company G had been reinforced during the afternoon of July the 10th, nor apparently that they had discovered that the company's front was protected by low barbed wire. The attacks of the 70th Infantry were thrown back with heavy losses. Machine gun and mortar fire from the 2nd Battalion 128th Infantry accounted for many Japanese, numbers of whom were caught as they tried to cross the barbed wire in front of Company G. According to Japanese sources, the results of the American artillery fire were even more disastrous. As soon as the enemy attack began, the 120th and 129th Field Artillery Battalions had started firing previously prepared concentrations along the bed of the east bank of the Drunamore. The Japanese units in or near the impact areas suffered very heavy casualties. The 1st Battalion, 78th Infantry was quickly reduced from 400 men to 30, principally as a result of the American artillery fire, which also destroyed large numbers of artillery weapons, machine guns, and motors. Despite this, the Americans, skillfully backed by artillery support, ultimately repelled them with significant casualties. Following the initial repulse, Martin concluded that the reconnaissance in force was unnecessary and ordered the units involved to retreat behind the Drunamore River. Confusion amongst many Japanese units arriving late had delayed the commencement of the 80th Regiment's attack, which was directed at Company E and was similarly pushed back. But a second wave of attackers, probably comprising the 237th Infantry and heretofore uncommitted elements of the right flank unit, began pouring across the Drunamore River towards Company E at approximately 2 a.m. The new attackers overran the company command post and surrounded most of the unit's widely separated strongpoints. Fighting continued in the company sector for a little while, but the unit could not long withstand the overwhelming enemy pressure. Company organization and communications broke down. Worse still, the troops began to run out of ammunition and a general withdrawal commenced. By 3 a.m., the Japanese had breached a gap approximately 1,300 yards wide in the American lines, physically occupying that territory. Fortunately, the following hours remained relatively calm as the 78th and 80th Regiments regrouped to the south to resume their offensive. This lull enabled Martin to dispatch the 1st Battalion 128th Regiment to counterattack along the Animo-Afua Trail, aiming to reinforce the 2nd Battalion's positions. Initially encountering no resistance for the first 1,500 yards, the Americans were eventually halted by intense enemy fire at 10:30, compelling them to retreat back to Tiver. This fierce opposition convinced Martin that the enemy could advance directly westwards with minimal hindrance towards the Taji strips unless he abandoned the Drinamore River line. He decided to reorganize his forces along a secondary, delaying position at the X-Ray River Coronel Creek line, preparing for further counterattacks against the Japanese. Accordingly, while Company F maintained their position along the coast, the 128th Regiment began to fall back towards the creek. Further south, Cunningham opted to withdraw his cavalrymen into 2 stages, successfully reaching X-Ray by midnight. However, communication issues delayed Howie's 3rd Battalion, with most of the units arriving at the river the following day. A small contingent had to engage in combat with Japanese forces and couldn't reach X-Ray until July 13th. Despite this, Kruger and Hall disagreed with the decision to abandon Drinamore, promptly deploying the 124th Regiment for a potential counterattack. Martin, who was instructed to hold his position, was replaced by Gill, assuming direct command of the divided converging forces, now split into north and south forces. However, before the American counterattack could commence, Nara's infantry launched an assault towards Tiver and Coronel Creek on July 12th. The 128th Regiment successfully repelled them after a fierce confrontation. Meanwhile, Adichie dispatched the main body of the 41st Division and the reserve of the 66th Regiment towards Drinamore, augmenting pressure on the Pop Coast. Over to the south, Takai's units gathered across the river near Afua and Quamgirk, preparing for a final northward push. Finally, at 7:30 on July 13th, the American counteroffensive commenced as the 1st Battalion 128th Regiment swiftly moved from Tiver to Chakila, only to be ambushed by Japanese artillery. Nevertheless, precise artillery counterfire silenced most of the enemy artillery, enabling the Americans to advance eastwards towards the mouth of Drinamore. Meanwhile, the 124th Regiment, under Starr's command, advanced southwards along the Anamo-Afua Trail, facing strong opposition from the 237th Regiment. Despite encountering resistance, they managed to reach the river, although still positioned considerably north of their designated center line. Cunningham's South Force began its eastward movement from the X-Ray River at 10 a.m., successfully overcoming enemy positions along several stream crossings to reach the Drinamore near Afua. Consequently, all original crossing points on the Drinamore fell to the Allied forces, isolating the 20th Division and the 237th Regiment several miles west of the river's bank. By nightfall, Nara had regrouped his 237th Regiment for another assault on the 2nd Battalion 128th Regiment. Company E demonstrated its combat effectiveness by holding firm and repelling the Japanese forces, with the rest of the battalion successfully defending against subsequent small-scale attacks, marking the conclusion of Nara's offensive actions. The following morning, Gill's forces consolidated their defensive positions along the reformed river line, albeit with a 1,500-yard gap remaining in the center. Yet, now we need to head over to the India-Burma theater. The final phase was coming for the Battle of Imphal. By the start of July, the reopening of the Imphal-Kohima Road facilitated the resupply of the 4th Corps, enabling them to launch an offensive against the fatigued and under-resourced troops of General Mutaguchi's command. Additionally, 3 brigades from General Stopford's 33rd Corps advanced from the north, swiftly joining General Gracie's 20th Division in the endeavor to reopen the Ukhrul Road. Under intense pressure, General Yamachi's battered 15th Division's units hastily abandoned Tonggu and Sakpao, leading the 80th Brigade to occupy Lamu by July 2nd. The next day, the ailing general, who had long fallen out of favor with Mutaguchi, was carried from the battlefield on a stretcher and later died in a hospital at Maimyo. Lieutenant General Shibata Yuichi replaced him and promptly prepared the 51st and 67th Regiments to retreat. To cover their withdrawal, the newly arrived and utterly exhausted 60th Regiment was tasked with attacking towards Lamu, while General Miyazaki's troops assembled behind the Ukhrul. However, the 60th Regiment was so weakened that its attacks were easily repelled, and the 67th Regiment retreated in disorder, leaving the 51st to be encircled. On July the 8th, Colonel Omoto's troops fiercely broke through the encirclement in 3 columns, allowing Stopford's brigades to finally overcome the Japanese resistance at Ukhrul and capture the town. This forced Shibata to regroup his forces along a new line from Longshang through Sangshak to Sakak, ultimately enabling the British Indian forces to reopen the Ukhrul Road by July the 10th. With both supply roads reopened, the arrival of Stopford's brigades from the north, and the Japanese forces nearly routed, General Slim decided it was time to go on the offensive. Slim's plan involved the 33rd Corps taking over the Chinam-Saddle and the Tumu-Palal Road, while the 4th Corps cleared the Japanese from the Silchar Track and the Tidim Road. On the other hand, Mutaguchi was still planning a combined attack on the Palal area, involving the 15th Division, remnants of the 31st Division, and some units from the 33rd Division. Although he issued an attack order, the divisions were too battered to actually comply. The overall situation of the 15th Army went from bad to worse, and the only hope remaining was to rally the 31st at Humin, where they could give the troops a few days' rest, and then, after reorganization, they could dispatch them to the northern flank of the Yamamoto detachment to capture Palal. In early July, the 31st Division was concentrated in the area east of Mio-Thit, but discipline had disintegrated to the point that the division could scarcely be termed a combat force. The Torakai unit was organized with the 138th Infantry Regiment, less than 1 battalion, the 2nd Battalion 124th Infantry Regiment, and 1 artillery battalion to reinforce the Yamamoto detachment. At the same time, the 15th Army ordered the 33rd Division to attack Palal from the south with the 214th Infantry Regiment. The newly formed Torakai unit, however, failed to join the Yamamoto detachment, and the order for the 33rd to attack Palal was never even carried out. Consequently, on July the 9th, General Koabe had no choice but to order preparations for the withdrawal to a line connecting the Zibu Mountains, Mai Lake, Kaliwa, and Ganga. Mutaguchi intended to begin the retreat on July the 16th, directing the 15th Division towards Sitang, the 31st Division towards Thongdut, and the 33rd Division to Tidim, while the Yamamoto detachment would hold the Shinam Saddle until July the 24th, and then retreat to the Kuntang-Moray line to cover the main army's withdrawal to the Kabao Valley. On the southwest front, General Tanaka's forces had already started retreating from the Bishampur area, leaving a small covering force at Ningthok-Hong to prevent a pursuit by the 17th Division. As a result, General Cohen's brigades made limited progress against the stubborn rearguard, ultimately securing Ningthok-Hong by July the 16th after heavy bombardment, coinciding with Mutaguchi's general withdrawal. By the middle of July, Japanese resistance centered around Ningthok-Hong, Kakuno. A small hamlet about 300 meters wide and 500 meters long, it lay to the immediate south of Ningthok-Hong. Despite probing attacks by the 48th Indian Brigade's infantry and artillery firing upon their defenses, the Japanese held on. Finally, in the early hours of July the 16th, this small space was subjected to what was described as one of the heaviest artillery concentrations yet in the Burma campaign. In the space of an hour, approximately 9,000 shells were fired on Ningthok-Hong, Kakuno. Fortunately for the Japanese, they had withdrawn from the village just before the shelling had begun. By the time it ended, the village had been completely flattened and was pockmarked with waterlogged craters. And so the last Japanese stronghold in the Imphal Valley was taken. The 63rd Indian Brigade had also reached and occupied the Lamanai area around the same time. The 5th Indian Division, the other division in the reconstituted 4th Corps, now took over and commenced the chase of the Japanese 33rd Division down the road towards Tidim. The 5th Division, now led by Major General Geoffrey Evans, continued the pursuit while Stafford's brigades harassed the disordered retreat of the 15th and 31st Divisions. Despite their efforts, the 15th and 31st Divisions reached Thongdut by early August, and the 33rd Division managed to assemble around Chika by mid-August, under significant pressure and the serious threat of having their withdrawal cut off. The 33rd Division distinguished itself by displaying almost superhuman fighting power and repeatedly launched counterattacks against the pursuing British Indian 5th Division. The Yamamoto detachment, however, had failed to cover the Yazagao area, and in mid-August, the 33rd Division found itself in the vicinity of Chika, facing the serious threat of having its route of withdrawal cut off by the enemy, who was infiltrating into the Yazagao area from Moray and Chugunu through the Kabao Valley. On the southeastern approach to Imphal, the two armies continued to face each other over the Shinam Saddle. The Yamamoto force remained in place on these heights, and the front line was still on Scraggy. It was in the second half of July that a final, concerted effort was made to evict the Yamamoto force and finally push it down the Tamal Palau Road towards the India-Burma frontier. Led by the 23rd Indian Division, the operation involved 5 brigades in a 3-pronged attack. The central thrust was by the 37th Indian Brigade on the Shinam Saddle, with the support of all the available artillery and tanks. The 5th British Brigade was deployed behind it and ready to provide assistance. D-Day was to be July the 24th. The 1st Indian Brigade was sent through the hills on the right to arrive behind the saddle. The two were to push the Japanese back on the road, and it was hoped their withdrawal route would be cut off by the 49th Indian Brigade, who would arrive on the road after looping in from the far left. The 268th Indian Brigade would be to its left, protecting the flank. Before the Japanese could retreat, the 49th Brigade had to cut off General Yamamoto's withdrawal route by looping in from the far left. However, Mutaguchi had sent Colonel Sato Genpachi's reserve 61st Regiment to Tamu, who quickly counterattacked and reopened the route. Consequently, Yamamoto withdrew to Moray, allowing Roberts to swiftly capture the Nippon Hill and Scraggy. Within 2 days, the 23rd Division advanced down the road, forcing the Yamamoto detachment to retreat towards Mai Lake on July 30th. This marked the end of the Battle of Imphal and Operation Yugo, the Japanese Army's largest land defeat. Estimates vary, but about 30,000 Japanese soldiers died, and 23,000 were injured during the operation, including 6,000 killed at Kohima and 16,000 at Imphal. Additionally, the INA lost about 2,000 dead and 2,000 wounded. On the other hand, the British Indians suffered 16,000 casualties, with over 12,000 at Imphal. Though Mutaguchi's plan was initially effective and nearly succeeded in capturing Imphal, he underestimated the enemy's ability to resist his troops and quickly bring out reinforcements. Slim's overall strategy for Imphal succeeded, as the Japanese overextended themselves from the Chinwin River to the Imphal Valley, just as he had predicted. A crucial factor in the British Indian success was their air support, which kept the 14th Army supplied despite the road to Kohima being cut off. Ultimately, in an attempt to thwart a potential British Indian advance into Burma, Mutaguchi's 15th Army was utterly decimated by the failed attempt to capture Imphal. This failure allowed Slim to seize the moment and launch a rapid offensive into Burma, countering the Japanese Yugo plan. The Allies thus gained the upper hand, marking the beginning of the end for the Japanese control over Burma. Now, as a final note for this week, by late July, Admiral Somerville executed Operation Crimson, a coordinated naval and air assault against Japanese airfields in Sabang, Loknga, and Kudaraya. Departing Trincomalee on July the 22nd, Somerville's Task Force 62, comprising 2 carriers and 4 battleships, arrived off Sabang on the morning of July the 25th, ready to commence the bombardment. On July the 5th of 1944, the carriers Victorious and Indomitable arrived to Colombo, and by July the 22nd, they would be doing Operation Crimson, the bombardment of Sabang by the battleships, over which the carrier-borne aircraft would provide cover and take photographs of the damage. The 2 carriers tossed up 47 naval fighters, of which there was 39 corsairs, commanded by Lieutenant Commander Turnbull. The force assembled for the operation, and they were designated Task Force 62, as the carriers were supported by Queen Elizabeth, Valiant, Renown, Richelieu, Nigeria, Kenya, Gambia, Ceylon, Cumberland, Phoebe, Trump, Relentless, Rotterdam, Racehorse, Raider, Roebuck, Rocket, Rapid, Killiam, Quality, and Quick Match. The submarine Templar and Tantalus were also deployed to ASR positions. The carriers operated only 35 miles north of Sabang, not far from the battleships which approached their bombardment positions by 6:40 a.m. The initial launch was planned for 33 minutes before sunrise, but this proved to be too early as the morning was exceptionally dark and the launch was delayed for 5 minutes. Even then it was too early, and the form-up was clumsy and slow, delaying departure. The fighters were briefed to attack Sabang, Loknga, and Kudaraya airfields, but at 6:38, NAS made a bad landfall since maps lacked detail and no photographs were available. When the target airfields were found, it was still too dark for accurate strafing, but the enemy was alert and opened fire as soon as the aircraft came within range. To air crews accustomed to the excellent intelligence material by then available in the home fleet, this caused concern and it had to be accepted that it was difficult to obtain good targets without losing the element of surprise. At very low level on a dark morning, flying at about 400 knots with flashes from anti-aircraft gunfire all around them, camouflaged aircraft in revenants were inconspicuous and the strafing runs were not very successful. One Corsair was shot down, but the pilot was rescued. Concurrently, the battleships targeted harbor facilities and military barracks at Sabang, while cruisers and destroyers shelled radar and wireless stations and engaged enemy shore batteries. After the main bombardment, the destroyers Tromp, Quality, Quick Match, and Quilliam entered Sabang Harbor, attacking Japanese positions and launching torpedoes, sustaining light damage from return fire. On the return journey, 2 enemy reconnaissance aircraft were intercepted and shot down by fighters. Additionally, 10 Zeros attacked Somerville's convoy, but they were intercepted by 13 Corsairs, leading to 2 Zeros being shot down and another 2 damaged. Following this engagement, British pilots noted the Japanese airmen were not as proficient as they had been in 1942. Although Operation Crimson's outcomes were not spectacular by any means, Somerville's final offensive was still deemed successful enough. Due to health concerns, he was subsequently transferred to diplomatic duties at Admiral Mountbatt's request. Currently, Admiral Mountbatten was moving towards a complete rearrangement of higher offices in Siak. From the time of his arrival in the Far East, he had trouble with his three commanders-in-chief. When the Imphal crisis arose, Mountbatten was dissatisfied with General Gifford's conduct of operations, and when he later found Gifford taking what Mountbatten considered a highly negative approach towards an aggressive conduct of operations, he resolved to ask for Gifford's relief. Mountbatten's relations with Admiral Somerville had been equally difficult. Somerville had refused to treat him as Supreme Commander, and in Mountbatten's opinion tried to make him simply the chairman of a Commanders-in-Chief committee. As for the RAF, Commander Air Chief Marshal Pierce, Mountbatten was not seeking his relief because he did not wish to change all of his principal subordinates simultaneously. After its relief, Somerville was placed in charge of the British naval delegation in Washington, D.C. in October of 1944, where he managed to surprise almost everyone to get on very well with the notoriously abrasive and very anti-British Admiral Ernest King, the United States Chief of Naval Operations. I would like to take this time to remind all of you that this podcast is only made possible through the efforts of Kings and Generals over at YouTube. Please go subscribe to Kings and Generals over at YouTube and continue to help us produce this content by checking out www.patreon.com/kingsandgenerals. And hey, don't forget about our sister podcast over at the Age of Conquest, The Fall and Rise of China podcast, written and narrated by me. And if you're still hungry for some more history, why don't you check out my personal channel, the Pacific War channel over at YouTube. If you'd actually really like to help me out, I'm going to be releasing a lot of podcasts over on the YouTube channel. For example, this week will be an episode where I explain all the faults of General Douglas MacArthur during his blunder of the Philippines defense. This will be followed by an episode comparing the battles of the Atlantic and the Pacific, me talking to my friends after a few drinks about some of the dumbest moments of World War II, and many more episodes. I think it'll be of interest to you. Also, please, if you have a chance, check out my Patreon account at www.patreon.com/thepacificwarchannel, where for as little as $2 a month, you get access to the exclusive Patreon podcast, early access to all the content I make, and voting rights for what I will tackle next. This month's exclusive Patreon podcast episode is on the Force Z disaster, titled The End of the Battleship. Give it a look. The Battle of Noemfoor was just getting started, seeing General Douglas MacArthur not giving the Japanese a moment to catch their breath. Meanwhile, the battle for Imphal was finally coming to a bitter end, as Mutaguchi's megalomaniac operation was clearly a disaster.